Okay.
Did you get a lunch?
No.
They're right behind you. Grab a lunch.
I'll grab one. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Do we, Erica, have we had any interaction with the live stream people? Can we tell if they, like,
Kara said she posted a question, but it's not visible.
really?
Oh, Kara.
Kara?
There is an answer. Yeah.
Do we need to do anything to get the recording?
Yeah. I'll grab my second lunch here. Take care. I'll be back at what, 4:15 or something? Okay. All right. Cool.
Stavo dicendo che Simone arriva, no? Dall'Italia. Manda un telegramma al padre che sta lì in Somalia, si torni con la tuta degli Abruzzi. La zucca degli Abruzzi, tuttavia, non era un piroscafo che faceva i collegamenti Italia-Africa, bensì un transatlantico che faceva i collegamenti con le Americhe. Quindi c'è un legame ancora tra migrazione e colonialismo. Chissà perché nel film, cioè, a parte che, ma anche se è ignoranza e se è uno sbaglio, è comunque divertente, perché ti dà l'idea di come abbiamo scelto una nave famosa, X. Dice la prima volta che va a New York. Ah, ciao, ecco perché vuole prendere il caffè oggi. Vabbè, ma
Great. So this is organized by a group called the Migration Studies Working Group. I'm Eleanor Painter, I'm part of this group, and several of us are here or have been here throughout the day. So Carolyn Mueller is online. I keep pointing at the camera, but she's there in Germany. Johanna Selman is here. Kelly Yotebieng spoke in the last session, had to leave, but she's also on our board. And we have, at the helm of our tech center, Eric Scalfiti, who's also a member and is helping us with the live stream and all other tech things. So thanks to all of you, and thanks to ASC Tech for their help in setting this up. So we're an organization that offers a space for people doing different kinds of work on migration studies or with different migrant communities to come together and share their work and share their ideas. And we do this through small group reading discussions, and then once a year we have this event, which is meant to showcase the kinds of work that are being done at OSU, but also it's always been really important to us to include and try and build bridges across work that's being done in communities. And a lot of us are also doing different kinds of community work, and so finding ways to bring these spaces together and create dialogue or make space for further dialogue has been a big part of what we are trying to do with this event, and that's one of the reasons why we're especially happy about this third session, where I think we'll hear a lot about some of this community work and really ground some of the questions on immigrant rights in local experience first, and thinking about what's happening here. I'm going to just say a couple of things about the rest of the day, which is, following this session, we have a session on the global Mediterranean, which has been organized by Danielle Scone and Terry Cashton, and several of the speakers are also here. And that will be still in here. It's our final session of the day, and we'll have a reception after that. So that's one on the global Mediterranean. Also a session meant to offer a lot of ideas for thought and start a conversation. And we have up here a table of books. These are actually gifts for our different presenters throughout the day, but we're leaving them up here first so that you can go through them and see. So these are books that are research or literature or art-based work that has to do with some of the issues that have come up in the sessions today. So I encourage you to take a look, sign the butcher paper, write your thoughts. There's lots going on. We have a hashtag MSS 2019. I'm going to stop and turn it over to the session to get this started. So we have two speakers, and this session is moderated by Professor Theresa Delgadillo, so I'll introduce her and then I'll let her tell you how the session's going to go. I would say that when we envisioned this, we really wanted it to be a dialogue. So you're going to hear a couple of presentations, and then we hope to be hearing a lot from you as well. No pressure. So Theresa Delgadillo is a professor in the Department of Comparative Studies here at OSU, a specialist in Latinx studies with numerous publications. She's here to moderate today, and in the program you'll see an article that she's recommended. I also recommend that you read it. If you haven't checked it out already, that might be really interesting reading for you to take up afterwards today. And I'll just hand it over to you, Theresa. Thank you.
Thank you. Congratulations to the organizers of the symposium for organizing such an important event and discussion. And thanks to all of you for attending. We do hope, and I do hope that you have questions and comments in this session in particular. I want to introduce the two panelists for this session. First, Amy Bittner, who is managing partner at Muchnicki and Bittner. Amy obtained her law degree from Ohio State University's Moritz College of Law, and prior to studying the law, Amy obtained a bachelor's degree in Spanish and then a master's degree in Spanish, focusing on Latin American literature and culture. Amy holds a law license from the state of Ohio and is admitted to the United States District Court for the Southern District of Ohio and the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. Amy regularly presents informative sessions to the community on immigration subjects and provides pro bono consultations organized through the Catholic Diocese of Columbus. Amy is an adjunct professor of immigration law at the Moritz College of Law at Ohio State University, and she's chair of the Ohio chapter of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. She's going to speak with us a little bit about her work, and then her presentation will be followed by Ruben Castilla Herrera, who is a second-generation Mexican-American born in Seguin, Texas, and he spent his childhood as a migrant farm worker in California, Oregon, and Washington before going on to graduate from Willamette University and then the Methodist Theological School in Delaware, Ohio, which I assume is right to Ruben has been a long-time organizer and activist fighting for justice, freedom, dignity, and liberation for all people here in Columbus. He's the founding member of several Latinx-related organizations, including the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce of Central Ohio, Educators in College Concerned with Moving Hispanics Forward, and the Central Ohio Worker Center, and most recently, the Columbus Sanctuary Collective. He began working on issues of immigrant rights as the State Director of Reform Immigration for America, a national organization fighting for comprehensive immigration reform. And he worked in Arizona in 2010, organizing against anti-immigrant legislation SB 1070, and in Georgia fighting HB 87. He has been arrested on separate occasions for civil disobedience fighting for immigrant rights in Georgia, Arizona, and Washington, D.C. He's currently, as I said, active with the Columbus Sanctuary Collective, which is a faith-based strategy to stop deportations and unified resistance to immigration. So please welcome our two panelists.
Thank you so much, Theresa, and thank you everyone for having me here today. I'm a little under the weather, so I'm going to try hopefully not hack. If I do, I apologize very much. So I'm here today to talk to you about what immigrants are presently facing considering the recent changes by the Trump administration. I wear a few hats, as you heard, but mostly I am an immigration attorney, an immigration practitioner. That means I represent individuals in the United States or sometimes abroad in their efforts to immigrate to the United States legally, or if they are already here, to achieve a permanent legal status in the United States. Because I do speak Spanish, the vast majority of my clients are Latinos who tend to be undocumented until they become my clients. I feel that I got involved in immigration because I feel this is a very important social justice and humanitarian concern. My goal is to keep families together and to keep families in a place where they feel safe. I just began teaching at Moritz a couple of years ago, and then I'm also the chapter chair of ALA, which you've heard of. That's about 300 some immigration practitioners in Ohio, and we lobby Congress for compassionate, comprehensive immigration reform, as well as have lots of educational efforts to uplift the immigration practitioners in the state. So I have a longer presentation about how things have changed in the immigration field since I've been practicing, but I'm going to limit this to the title of the presentation is what has changed in recent years. And the fact of the matter is a whole lot has changed in recent years since the Trump administration has began. What has not changed is our laws. As you all are aware, only Congress can change the laws. The laws have not changed. The laws have been the same. As you know, Congress isn't making much of an agreement on anything these days. What has changed enormously is how the executive enforces the laws. That is the role of the executive branch, the president, to put our laws into effect. So in the field of immigration, we have basically three different departments. We've got the Department of State, which is issuing the visas overseas. We have the Department of Homeland Security, and we have the Department of Justice. The Department of Homeland Security was created in 2003 by George W. Bush during his administration. We used to just have the INS. 2003, the INS got abolished, and we got the Department of Homeland Security. It has three administrative agencies under it. ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, who carries out deportations and detention. CIS, Citizenship and Immigration Services, that does the processing of administrative benefits like green cards, asylum, naturalization. And we have Customs and Border Patrol that patrols the borders and deals with customs when people enter the United States. And then the Department of Justice. I think most people probably don't think the Department of Justice has much to do with immigration, but let me tell you, this department has a huge role, especially the Attorney General, as I will get to. Because the Department of Justice has an administrative agency called EOIR, Executive Office of Immigration Review. That is the immigration court, in other words, the immigration court, who adjudicates removal proceedings once people are put in removal proceedings. So those are 3 departments in the President's Cabinet directed by the executive affecting immigrants. So the changes, huge changes just keep coming under this administration. At the January 2017, we had the travel ban, the first travel ban. There were 3 different versions of that were rolled out, and the 3rd version was ultimately upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States. And as an effect, I just saw the statistic yesterday, like 45,000 people have been denied visas to come to the United States because of this travel ban. So the countries that are affected are prohibited from, the Department of State is prohibited from issuing them immigrant visas. That really affects our population here in Columbus. In the Somali community, we have a very large Somali population, and Somalia is subject to the travel ban. So if your husband or your child is in Somalia and would otherwise be able to come here with an immigrant visa, they're subject to the travel ban, even if you are a United States citizen, and you have to apply for a waiver, which can take who knows how long, and it may or may not be granted. So we have that effect. Also in January 2017 is when the President issued 2 executive orders on immigration. One on exterior enforcement, and that one really got most of the attention because that was the let's build a wall executive order. But that same day, another executive order was issued on interior enforcement. And that was what was a greater sea change to me and to the undocumented immigrant community here. Because that executive order on interior enforcement explicitly canceled out a memorandum that was issued by the Department of Homeland Security in November 2014 during the Obama administration called the PET Memorandum, Priority Enforcement Program. Up until January 2017, ICE had been directed to use their resources for enforcement, meaning detention and placing in removal proceedings, in a strategic manner, such as to focus on criminals, recent arrivals, or those with recent orders of deportation. Under the PET Memorandum, just an undocumented, non-criminal person who was encountered by ICE would not be placed in removal proceedings. But as of January 2017, that policy was canceled out. It's off the table. Thereafter, in 2017, the President canceled DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals for the Dreamers. As a result of lawsuits that are still currently pending, DACA recipients are able to renew their DACA, but no one can apply for DACA for the first time, and DACA holders are not able to travel outside the United States. Shortly thereafter, the administration canceled temporary protected status, TPS, for foreign nationals of many countries who, for some of them for decades, have been allowed to stay here lawfully with their work permits. Again, the courts issued, there were many lawsuits filed, they are still pending, and the courts issued a preliminary injunction prohibiting the administration from canceling TPS. So as of now, that is still alive, but we await the resolution of those lawsuits. Then I must touch on the role of the Attorney General. Under the Immigration and Nationality Act, which is the code of immigration laws, the Attorney General has the power to refer to himself any case that is on appeal, essentially. So I was concerned when the President appointed Jeff Sessions as the Attorney General because he has a long history of being anti-immigrant. And actually, former Attorney General Jeff Sessions kind of took a while before he started exercising this power. Last spring, he started exercising this power in a very big way. And last spring, we had the Attorney General issue an opinion. So these are opinions that are by the Board of Immigration Appeals. That's the appellate body that's above them. immigration courts. Last spring, he issued one called Matter of Castro June that prohibits immigration judges from administratively closing deportation cases, which was a tool they used to have to control their dockets. In June, Judge Sessions issued Matter of AB, whereby through this holding of this one person, he said, generally, most domestic violence and gang asylum claims from Central America won't qualify for asylum, which is the vast majority of all asylum claims from Central America. Shortly thereafter, we have Matter of SOG and FTB, where Mr. Sessions held that the Attorney General doesn't have the authority to terminate removal cases, which was another form of docket control. And as a consequence, the number of pending cases in the immigration courts has skyrocketed. It was about 600,000 some before Trump took power, now it's 800,000 some. My new asylum cases are getting set for final hearings in the year 2022. We have separation of families, which occurred last June. ICE has drastically increased the number of people they're detaining. There's the vet quota that requires ICE to detain 34,000 people at all times. That's been the law since 2010. Presently, ICE is detaining about 44,000, 45,000 people, way above that. So the use of detention has vastly increased. Shortly, the administration announced the Remain in Mexico policy. This was just recently challenged a couple weeks ago in a lawsuit. This policy required asylum seekers to wait in Mexico while they process their cases. However, these people are supposed to have, they have a statutory right to counsel. So I don't know how someone who's required to stay in Mexico is going to get a U.S. attorney to present their asylum claim. So a lawsuit on that is pending. The processing of administrative applications with CIS has basically doubled during the Trump administration. Congress has started to pay attention to this, and they issued a letter recently to the director of CIS challenging him on this. CIS has changed its policy memorandums. They've turned into an enforcement agency. They're now required to put everyone in removal when they deny applications. At the Family Detention Center in Dilley, Texas, there's presently infants under the age of 1 that are detained with their mothers. That is something new. We've never detained babies before, like actual babies. So that's being challenged as well. So what I see as the largest challenge is this is a systematic attack on asylum seekers. You know, that's what I do, is represent individuals, but while the corporations are also hurting because they cannot get their international workers here, I don't think that people are dying as a result of it. And so I see that as the largest challenge. The glimmer of hope I have here is that thus far, except for the Supreme Court upholding the travel ban, the courts, our courts, have found that many of these policies are either unconstitutional or against the law, and they have been reversed. But these litigations is a long process of years, so we don't know what the ultimate outcome will be. Right, I'm going to stop writing down negativity and let Ruben tell you about how this affects the people on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Brincka. And let me just say that, first of all, I'm an organizer. And so I'm on the ground with the impacted communities, immigrants, refugees, undocumented people. But also I've been in Columbus most of my life, a long time. I love Columbus. I say that because we are part of a greater community. So the intersectionality of Black lives, of women, of the LGBTQ community, there's that intersection that is part of our community as well. And so there is an intersectionality as well, and that's a difficult one because we focus on immigrants, undocumented immigrants specifically. And so we've worked, I was introduced as being State Director of Reform Immigration for America. We worked on that for 8 years with the former president. I was there when it happened. I was in the room when he said to us, it was a national LULAC convention, that comprehensive immigration reform, CIR, is going to be a priority of mine. President Obama said that, looked at us in the face and said it. And then he said something very interesting. He said, and if I don't do that, I want you to hold me accountable. And so we did, right? And we organized naturally to do that, and I could do a whole presentation on that process, but it did not happen. The priority became healthcare, and that was an issue, of course, and we did not get comprehensive immigration reform. That led to the fight for the DREAM Act, where the young dreamers organized to have the DREAM Act, and that did not happen either. We lost in the Senate. The Congress passed it, and we lost in the Senate. And I'll never forget, I was there when that happened in Washington in the Senate chambers with Dreamers. And I remember clearly when the Dreamers left the hearing, and we were all in this big room, and some were crying, emotional, and they composed themselves there quickly, and they said, what are we going to do next? And that's where the whole idea of DACA started, right? And so DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, came from young people, the impacted community, right? And we fought President Obama at the time to get it. President Obama refused to grant that to us by executive orders. How many executive orders has this administration done on immigration, right? And so we fought for it, and we did it by the only means that we did. I say we, but it was mostly the young people using social media, using very little resources. And then when that didn't happen, then we started doing unprecedented things, interrupting the president when he would speak, interrupting him, right? How disrespectful we would get from our friends and allies in that party, right? And then when that didn't work, we occupied his offices, his re-election offices, in Cincinnati, in Dallas, in Houston, in Los Angeles, in Phoenix, in Miami, in Atlanta, in Chicago, and we sat in his offices and occupied them. And it just so happened that when the re-election was coming, because politics and elections speaks loudly when it comes to people in power, that is when we received DACA. And so it's really interesting to hear it be referred to as President Obama's DACA program, which I see it as a program of the young people who fought for it. Right? Let that story never be forgotten. But the young people were smart. They realized that it wasn't just about them, and they fought for DAPA, for parents, and that didn't happen that long. It happened actually, but it got live. It's in the courts, and it didn't happen. So now we have new administration, and things have changed, and all that we have now, there's nothing. I think you mentioned it. There's nothing on the federal level on comprehensive immigration reform at all. The only thing that's happening to those very agencies, mostly ICE, is criminalization, incarceration, detention, deportation. And then, of course, the craziness of the ongoing debate of building the wall and the emergency declaration to build this wall. And I feel that it actually creates an emergency. And it's an affront to democracy, the so-called democracy. And it's also a test of this president's authoritarian power. So these actions represent a threat to border communities and to the U.S.-Mexican border, but also a threat across the country, a threat in Columbus, Ohio, a threat in this state, right? I can name the places in the state where it's a threat more so, but it's really about disregarding and discounting our civil liberties, and even, dare I say, it's about advancing a white supremacy agenda. Did you hear that? Did you hear that? It's about advancing a white supremacy agenda. So the president is going to continue. He's going to continue to use immigrants as a scapegoat and the borderlands as a battleground. And people will die, and they are dying in the meantime. So welcome, my fellow Ohio State friends and Ohioans. Welcome to the borderlands. Ohio State is actually a borderlands state, but now we're seeing more people that are understanding this when we've been fighting for, to reform for 10 years, but actually the fight has been much longer than that. But actually the fight the fight is about people. And that's what I want to focus the rest of my time on. And it's people, it's sort of hinted, personas, with names, people with stories, people with familias, right? And so what we do on the ground is really, we are face to face with these stories. And then we have to ultimately go to the system and to the law and to attorneys to able to get some kind of relief for them. So I'm with the Sanctuary Collective. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm going to show you. I'm going to focus on one person who's in Sanctuary, right now by the name of Marion. If we could just go to the next slide. So sanctuary is basically we're displacing people. This is where oh, let me just stop there. If there's gonna be a picture of the girls, the family, and I'm gonna ask that not be put out there. You'll see it because I have the permission to show it to you, but I don't want it to be out there. And there's a reason for that. So this is when Miriam. This was in July when she entered the sanctuary, and we actually moved. I mean, we were moving so many people out of their homes to move into the church. Church is a sensitive location that ICE, one of the departments of Homeland Security that was described to you, has said we will not go into churches or places of worship. We will not go into educational institutions here. They will not come and pick me up if I'm undocumented here, but they could be waiting on the other side of High Street. No? So they won't go to schools, churches, hospitals, and then rallies, immigration rallies. And this is the room before Miriam came in. I mean, there's 4 people living in that room, and we cleaned it up and we fixed it up, and that is where she's currently living at First English Lutheran Church on East Main Street on the east side, of the near east side. Let's go to the next one. And this is a picture, we will not show that, so we'll take a picture of that. This is the family. This is Miriam. Miriam is from Honduras, and her husband is Mexicano, Mexican, and her child on the left, Camila, is 9, and sitting down on her lap is Stephanie, who right now has got an emergency. This is Nationwide Children's Hospital. And there's a team there around her that's taking care of her. Stephanie also is autistic, and she requires, she's functioning, but she requires therapy, weekly therapy. Let's go to the next one. So sanctuary, this is the pastor of the church where she's at, and literally when somebody goes into sanctuary, we let ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, know where they're at. ICE is on downtown Columbus, 4th Front, and Broad Street, West Broad Street, in the 11th tower, 3rd floor. And so we let them know where she's at, and that way it's not harboring her. Sanctuary is also public. Her case is somewhat public. This is a press conference we had when she entered sanctuary in the front of the Lutheran Church. And there she is with the pastor. I'm not sure what that picture either. I keep forgetting to take that back picture out. But and then there's this little Stephanie who just got her glasses there at Nation Children Hospital. That's not the picture of her. But also, Sanctuary is creating movement. We're organizers. These are students from Capital University that came to event. So students, young people are important. The immigrant community is around her. The city council just this last Monday passed a resolution that they're holding up supporting her and Edith, who's in sanctuary at the Mennonite Church in Clintonville. It's also the black community. That's intersectionality. Miriam is in the black church, right? And so there's a black community that we're organizing to support for her as well. Next one. And it's also working within the system. These are representatives of Congresswoman Joyce Beatty's office, who came to events we just had last Monday. And it's also Ohio State University. For some of you might recognize Professor Paloma Martinez, who came to speak, and he did some performances for an event. But it's also organizing the community people. There's a meeting we had on strategy and how we're going to get her out, and how we're going to apply pressure, grow the community to have her released. And then there's a picture of all of us there. These are pretty much the community on the east side picture we took. And really it's about that message here. Immigrants and refugees are welcome here. So beyond the walls, beyond the borders, beyond the lies, beyond the hate, the MAGA hats, the bigotry, the racism, the sexism, the homophobia, the voter suppression, the poverty, the politicians, and beyond the struggle lie our freedom and our liberation, and they are on the faces of people like Mariam Vargas and her children. And as I said before, there are people with names and stories and families, familias, and with struggles. And this is where we focus our energies and our hopes. And really, that's what our struggle is about. But ultimately, we have to go to the system, right? And so the number one objective, as soon as they enter sanctuary, is the question is, how do we get them out? How do we get that back home? And we have attorney teams that are working on all the cases. There's 6 cases in Ohio. There's 55 sanctuary cases throughout the country. And Ohio and North Carolina and Texas have the most sanctuary cases. So that's a little bit about it. I'll be happy to answer questions later.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much. We want to open the session for discussion, comments, and questions from the audience. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Yaoundé. I got a two-part question for both panelists. Hi, I have a two-part question. A, what are you guys or your organizations are doing about statelessness in America? I don't see that term comes when people are talking about immigration issues. And B, I also don't hear anybody saying anything about the indefinite hold policy that's been in effect since 9/11. I mean, that year. In the last 5 or 6 years, we haven't heard anybody saying anything about it, like it's a fact. It's okay, and let it be. Thank you.
All right. Well, I feel your questions are, to me, they're related because you talked about indefinite hold policy. So I perceive you're talking about someone who does have a deportation order, and ICE would otherwise deport them. However, they're not getting deported because they are stateless or they don't have.
I'm talking about change of status. But when you apply for change of status, they will hold your file indefinitely.
Oh, like in background checks?
No, they do the background check, but then they put hold, and that's it. They don't make a decision on it. They don't open it.
I see what you're saying. I mean, I think that goes along with how administrative processing is taking a long time. I'm sorry. Well, that makes me think of what I said, that's a time to go to the court. It's a time you can sue in federal court under the Administrative Procedures Act that the agency is being unreasonable, and then a federal judge will review that. When the administrative agency brings up security concerns, though, national security concerns, is when that gets stickier. With regard to the statelessness, if someone, if they do not have a homeland, if they're not recognized being a citizen from somewhere, they can't get removed. If you are stateless, you can apply for asylum under that basis. It's very fact specific for individual cases. I'm not certain if I'm answering your question. I'm going to see how Ruben give some input.
I haven't had, we don't have any cases currently as you define statelessness, but what comes to mind are the Mauritanians in Columbus. There's a large Mauritanian African community here that are being deported to a country to their sure death. And so I don't know enough about the particulars about that, but that's the closest that I can understand. But for us, the people that we have there, most of the people that we were working with are applying for asylum. Kind of like what you said, we're just basically on hold. And in the cases, in Marion specifically, we just haven't heard from immigration. Our appeals that we filed, we've asked for some documents, and they're just sitting on them. I think that they're waiting her out as a strategy. So that's where the organizing comes in. That's where our voice. That's why we lobby the politicians and somebody, Joyce Beatty or Senator Brown or even Senator Portman. We weigh in what they can, what kind of power their voice might have. And quite frankly, that's been a struggle.
I just want to add to that I think in the realm of cultural politics that there is an increasing statelessness of immigrants and refugees. If you have to flee your country because you are in danger or suffering, and yet you cannot be received anywhere else, and are therefore also in a continued precarious situation. It really, and I think about the migrant caravans in particular, like what does it mean when people have to organize from the ground level themselves to transport themselves, because there is no state that can offer them a secure place or secure transportation. And that's not even, that safety is not guaranteed when they arrive here. So that, I mean, I think it speaks to a larger kind of condition of statelessness, separate from the legality of statelessness that is emerging in our time, and that I think is a real concern. Did you know it's coming? No, I can't.
We can pass it around. It's partly so the people on the streaming can hear, but also just feel like amplifying your voice that will work.
Thank you for the informative session. Sounds really great. I have a question about the changes in the way that undocumented immigrants or asylum seekers receive legal aids. I'm thinking of people who can, or who don't really have financial means to hire a lawyer. Are there any like pro bono works that are being done nationally and in the state of Ohio, and any changes regarding that kind of assistance?
That's my question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, honestly, so immigrants in removal proceedings, asylum seekers, they have the right to counsel. However, they have to get their own counsel. There's nothing that's the equivalent of a public defender as if you were in the criminal system. There is a new effort, it's a joint collaborative from my organization, AILA, with the American Immigration Council. It's called the Immigrant Justice Campaign. This just started a couple years ago, but we're kind of, Ohio is one of their test states because we have the NEOCC, the Northeastern Ohio Correctional Center up in Youngstown, which is where ICE detains a whole lot of people. And so the goal of the Immigrant Justice Campaign is to increase pro bono representation amongst the detained immigrants. There needs to be more, quite frankly. I mean, in Ohio, there's not a lot. There's Catholic Charities in Cleveland and Cincinnati. Here in Columbus, we really just have CREFS, Community Refugee and Immigration Services, that does as much as they can, but they can't represent a lot of people in removal proceedings. So Ohio needs more. But there's something really important I want to tell you guys about that I left off that's related to that. The administration has basically just shut down the ports of entry on the southern border and is not letting people in. Like when the caravan came up, this happened. They're in Tijuana. There's like thousands of immigrants in Tijuana waiting for the opportunity to enter this country to apply for asylum. And they have a list. They're giving them a number, like at the deli, and everyone has their number. And they're writing it on their arm. And so people then are comparing it to like Holocaust victims. And they're only letting in a few people a day. And there's an organization, a nonprofit called El Otro Lado, which means the other side in Spanish. And El Otro Lado is organizing volunteers and volunteer attorneys who go down there and help them. And just a couple of weeks ago, two of the attorneys from El Otro Lado, that they're United States citizens, and they had all their paperwork in order to work in Mexico. They're legally working in Mexico. They returned to Tijuana, and the United States State Department had put a flag, a security flag, on their passports, and they were detained in Mexico, and they were deported from Mexico back to the United States. Mexico didn't let them in to do their jobs. So that's new as well.
So the reason I said that's our question, because we know that aside from even legal representation, the cost of that, there's filing fees, and so part of the work that we do is raise money. Here in Columbus, you're right, in Ohio there's very few entities. The city of Columbus, I think it allocated, I don't know, maybe it's 200,000 plus at one point. Congressperson Liz Brown introduced that and it was passed. And that sounds like a lot of money, but it's not really. The UU's Unitarian Universalists have just started a fund, and I was looking for the flyer, that they're raising money specifically for bond money or to pay attorneys something. So it's something that you realize that most of the people going through the courts can't afford attorneys, right? And so it's a select few that really can. And so we're constantly, aside from being with the people, hearing their stories, trying to help, not a social service. Our goal is to empower them, right? To speak and do with the privileges that we have as people who've been here, speak English, understand how to navigate the systems. A big part of what we do is raise money as well. And that's the great thing about this. If there's a silver lining on this administration, is that those people have come out more, are starting to understand the story a little bit more. At least more of the privileged community, mostly white community, are coming out and who have the ability to donate. And so, I mean, we just received a substantial donation from an anonymous donor but probably likely is illegal. But it is something that we have to raise constantly.
Yes.
So I would say immigration law is difficult, right? Because you're working within this exploitative system. And I would say that to a certain extent that there's an exploitation of immigrant narratives. Like particularly when immigrants are seeking asylum, there's this expectation for them to kind of package and commodify their pain. And this is consequently upholding this like falsified narrative that the US is an exceptionally free place and they're coming from exceptionally oppressive places when it's obviously more complicated than that. So I'm wondering how you try and combat this kind of tension in your work where you want to earn this protection for immigrants without like maintaining these falsified stories.
Honestly, for a person of color, for a queer person of color in this community, that's something that I find just that, right? And it also reminds me of the Dreamers when they were fighting for the Dream Act. Someone said, I was just listening because I'm not a dreamer, and someone said, and I never forget that they said, our struggle is not to get ID or citizenship. That's not our fight. Our fight is to how do you say it? Our fight is to redefine what it means to be a citizen of this country. Our fight is not to get citizenship, but to redefine what it means to be a citizen of this country and of this world, right? Limited to this country. And so ultimately, that's the fight. And it's not an easy thing to do because when I said earlier, Miriam says, I love Columbus. I'm thinking, wow, the Columbus police are killing us, right? And so how do you give hope or maintain the reality? But really, I think that we all do, but immigrants in general come from that struggle. They understand in a whole different context than we do. And I really can't answer that clearly, but I think that when it's focused on your children, just immediate needs, a friend of mine who's a doctor says there's always a way. There's always a way. When I believe sometimes that there's not, right? And so that hope of that struggle, that's always been our struggle. That's why we've come this far. That's why we survived. And whether that's faith-based, could be, or familia-based, it could be the same thing or different. I don't know. But what we try to do is work on immediate. And then people, there's stages of consciousness, right? And people, the dreamers specifically, because they're young, they understand the system and they understand the struggle differently. But that's the difficult thing. Everyone is a different understanding of the system and the consciousness, and even intersectionality, right? And so that's something that it's, for me anyway, it's constantly just kind of in everything that I do and have. And basically, that's all that I have.
Our U.S. asylum law is extremely restrictive, which I think that might be what prompted your question. You have to be persecuted or have a well-founded fear of future persecution based on, well, there's only 5 protected grounds: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or social group. That's it. Social group is really the most useful category unless you do have something blatantly political or racial, because you can define what is your own social group. So we have a plethora of case law throughout the nation of what defines a social group and what is or what isn't. And many years ago, the courts rejected, young Salvadorian men subject to gang recruitment as a social group. However, the conditions in those countries in the Northern Triangle, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, are so dangerous, many of them are fleeing because of the gang recruitment. And if you just look at the case superficially like that, they flat out don't qualify for asylum. But that's all we have. So, in my job as an immigration advocate, we just try to be very creative and pull out as many facts as you can to distinguish their case from social groups that have already been rejected. I mean, at the end of the Obama administration, there was a movement among the immigration activists, like spearheaded by the Representative Louise to redesignate those Northern Triangle countries for TPS based on the gang warfare that's going on in there. So under the immigration laws, you can designate TPS on natural disaster or war. And I was really excited about that, but then we had a change of administration, and that obviously is going nowhere. So some people, you can't just immigrate to the United States because you want to anymore, like how my great-grandparents did from Europe. I mean, the laws are that someone who's already here, who's your relative or employer, has to apply for you. You can't just come here and arrive and be like, I want to be in the United States. Our law does not permit that. It's really ridiculous. Another solution would be just like a work permit. Just have a work permit for people who just want to come work for a while and leave. That doesn't exist either. There's no standalone work permit. It is only linked to another application. So it's a big problem. We need change for solutions.
You can have a hand over you.
Yeah. All right. My question is for Mr. Katia. So you mentioned earlier that you were in the room when Obama promised that he wanted to prioritize immigration reform, and that he wanted you to hold him accountable for it. But ultimately, that didn't happen. My question is, what specific reforms were you expecting to see? And in that same vein, given the upcoming elections, what kind of reforms would you like to see Trump's opponents promise?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm trying to remember what the basic fight for immigration reform was, but I know it's been so long, we've moved on since then, but I know one was just due process on the system. One was a pathway to citizenship. And those are very vague, right? Those all have ways to do that. Maybe some of the other,
Yeah, I mean, we need a solution for the undocumented people here. Like during the Reagan administration, there was an amnesty, the SAW, Special Agricultural Workers. So with the current immigration laws, if you're already here and you're undocumented, there's basically no way to change your status. You're just stuck here. So I think that's what the Gang of Eight, when they passed the Comprehensive Immigration Reform through the Senate, but then Speaker John Boehner were not allowed on the floor. That plan was going to eliminate the backlogs. It was like decades-long wait if you are lucky enough to qualify for a family-based immigrant visa to come here. First, eliminate the backlogs, and then deal with the undocumented population in the United States. So I think that's what we need, and that, of course, includes the Dreamers.
Yeah, and the second part of the question is that I think that's something that I think we need to start asking ourselves. I mean, what it's done for many of us, because we're now on the ground and really we've gone back to just taking care of ourselves on the ground, and that doesn't make that any less important. But that's all we have. A sanctuary is not immigration reform. It's not going to get us there, right? And we're not trying to get people with sanctuary. We're trying to get them out. And so I think that there has to be some kind of, and then for me, as someone who understands what I just, the example I used earlier, that the real struggle is redefining what it means to be a citizen. Because even for us citizens, a driver's license is a privilege, right? And you're penalized by it being taken away. Citizens, right? So So how do we, on that level, how do we try to redefine what it means to be a citizen? And again, that's where the intersectional fight of Black lives and queer trans lives and women's rights, and all of that is part of that. But right now, I just feel that, honestly, the system is not working for us. And I'm probably, I know that that's where the change's got to happen through policy, but I'm not sure that we're going to get it through either side, honestly. And so pushing, as organizers, we ask the questions, we have to continue taking those risks, and those risks are often being ostracized in different ways politically, and we're crazy people, right? Abolish ICE. You just said we abolished INS. I mean, and people think we're crazy for saying we want to abolish ICE. Abolishing INS was done by a president, right? And so we have to continue pushing. We have to. I can't answer it. And not only that, but more than that, we have to ask the impacted community, because I am not undocumented, and so the impacted community. We used to have a chant that would say, "No more meetings about us without us," right? And so how do we get the voice and keep the voice of the people? That's the challenge, and that's what we're continually working on. But freedom is a constant struggle, right? And it's ongoing. It doesn't end. It just changes. But we have hope. We don't give up. We keep fighting. We get arrested. We get killed. We have an activist right now that's missing. That's been missing for a month. One of my black sisters in Columbus. We take our lives even because we don't know what to do, right? And so it's a constant struggle, but we have to continue. We need each other, and we need you. And I think I'm going to put it back on you as a young person, presumably a privilege, right? And you answered me that question.
How does the language and the terms surrounding migration and the work that you do affect migrant advocacy? Or like when you were talking about like abolish ICE and people are pushing back against that, how does it affect the work that you do?
How does it affect what?
The work that you do and people's opinions of that work.
Well, definitely. Around July, around the same time that Mary entered the sanctuary, we had an abolish ICE action downtown. We worked outside the system. We literally, a group of people chained themselves with bike locks around their neck and around themselves to a desk in the ICE office. We shut down the ICE office. Now, that ICE office for a half hour, right? And the point was exactly that, to get some attention. We didn't shut down ICE. We didn't abolish ICE. But also outside, we had this tripod, like 60-foot blocks that were put together. The person was dangling from the top. Maybe you saw, it made national news. We blocked the entrance to ICE that they bring in people and take them out to be deported or detained. And so I mean, we got all kinds of kind of backlash from that. What good is that going to do? Well, it basically is it's about conveying, thinking of creatively, and sometimes in the risk of how to move our message. And in that case, it was abolish ICE. But for the most part, we've been constantly organizing, thinking, what is it that we can do? How can we get these people out of sanctuary? What's going to get the attention of the congressperson, or the president, or the mayor, or the city council? We just had a resolution passed that supported these two women, right? It's non-binding. It's just a resolution. It took us a year to get that from Democrats, presumably our friends, our allies, right? And regardless, it happened, and we're happy about that. But it's constantly just kind of, all we have right now is we're just trying to kick the can, trying to do something to get some kind of relief locally, administratively, or through the system, ICE system, and that's the best that we have. I'm not sure I answered that, but it has been challenging.
Do you want to speak about that? Whether that impacts legal struggles at all? Yes.
Thanks to you both. I'm thinking a lot about the ways that what you're addressing have to do with the need to focus locally and also nationally. So a lot of these issues, even though they're international, they become domestic issues in some way. But they're also happening in different regions around the world. And I wonder if you could say something about what you know about the possibilities for some kind of conversation across countries. Is there work being done that puts, for example, lawyers here in conversation with lawyers who are dealing with the same questions about asylum in other countries? Are there connections between different activist groups that are thinking also across national borders, or is it something that, for the reasons that you've been mentioning, has to sort of stay here?
That's, there's a lot there, mostly possibility. I think the fact that, for example, Amy and I know each other, work with each other, and let me just say, I don't have that relationship, but we don't have that relationship with all immigration attorneys. I don't know there's enough immigration attorneys here. And then there's, for us as organizers, there's immigration attorneys, and then there's immigration attorneys, right? People who understand the struggle with the people, right? And there are immigration attorneys that are out there that are just want to make money. I mean, we live in a capitalistic country, right? And so I guess that's okay. But our interest is how do we work with, what's the relationship? And that's honestly, it's a constant struggle as well. And so we're trying to do that. There's something else you asked specifically.
I was thinking especially about the fact that you're wrestling with asylum law, for example, which is actually an international question, but then the way it gets applied becomes a domestic issue. So I just wonder.
Well, the other is we just don't know what's going to happen. And so there could be something that reaches the Supreme Court or court system that changes. In fact, there was a ruling, what was it called? Pereira ruling that we were able, that went to the Supreme Court, that we were able to get 2 or 3 people came out of sanctuary because of that, right? And so sometimes time, and honestly, it could be even the election. So this is political as well. Like some people in sanctuary said, like, or asked constantly, are we going to have to wait till the election, this presidential election? And even then, we don't know what's going to happen, right? But in the meantime, I think that the collective specifically, when we're working, we have teams of people that are working on different cases specifically. It's a collective. It's not a good formalized structure, but it is a way to get people involved with the hands-on, seeing people, seeing their names. And in fact, there's a church not far from here, basically from campus, that likely could be a sanctuary church at some capacity, and it's not exciting to have somebody in sanctuary, but honestly, I thought, wow, it'd be right by the students, right? And how do we create movement with that happening? That's not happening yet. But to be sanctuary, it's not only housing someone, it's also helping people, helping their legal cases. And so there's teams of people that are working throughout the city, but we don't have students. The students are involved, and I know students are on a schedule, or like we're midterm time, and they're on a schedule, and you got to go home. But the creative thing, the student organizing has always been difficult because people, my experience is that by the time you're a junior or senior, you're kind of there, and then you're gone, right? But you go somewhere else. And so it's constantly building those communities of I would say faith. I don't mean religious faith. I mean faith and hope and helping people. That's kind of where we're at right now, really, in this administration. Because again, there's nothing that's happening legislatively. There are some things in the state where licenses, perhaps, and I think Michigan, Illinois, and Oregon are trying to get driver's license for undocumented, but they're at an early stage. It's still possible.
Going to the international asylum issue, I mean, it's complicated by the fact that there's really no binding international law because of sovereignty. Each nation is its own nation and has its own laws. The United States asylum law is based on the UN Convention of Refugees. 1980 is when the United States officially codified their accession to that international convention. But it does vary amongst countries. Like Europe's asylum law is more liberal than ours is. The only effort I'm aware of internationally about asylums is that there was a challenge filed, researching, I guess it must be in the Hague International Court, plaintiffs called an asylum-free zone in Georgia. In Atlanta, Georgia, we have an immigration judge his name is Judge Kazemi, who is notoriously, what do I want to say? Denies over 99% of all asylum claims. This man, I haven't had the pleasure of meeting him myself, but there is a wonderful resource from the University of Syracuse called TRAC, T-R-A-C, if you Google it. They have all the statistics on asylum grants and denials broken down by immigration court, by judge, by nationality. It is fabulous. And so I think it was last year this lawsuit was filed because the plaintiffs alleged that this part of the United States is an asylum-free zone. So that was filed, but I'm not aware of there being a resolution to that yet. That's all I'm aware of.
Thank you very much. We've run out of time for discussion. There's a little bit of break before the next one, so you can come in and up and talk to the speakers as well. But thank you all for participating.
bringing in speakers and having conferences and so on. And we had this wonderful discussion earlier, right before this panel, on immigration policy in the United States, and I think we'll see that there's a lot of, even if the situation in the Mediterranean is certainly distinct, there's a lot of similarity between what's happening on the U.S. border and in the Mediterranean. So I want to introduce the two moderators of this panel. We have Dr. Danielle Scone, right here, who is a cultural anthropologist with expertise in Roma, Turkish, and dance studies. Her current research is on the impact of Syrian migration to Turkey on urban Roma communities and the interaction of these groups via hip-hop music and dance. Danielle currently teaches a course on immigration politics, and she also teaches in the NELP program in Turkish studies. Our second moderator is Dr. Harry Kashdan, who is the current postdoctoral fellow in the global Mediterranean at the Ohio State University. Dr. Kashdan's PhD is in comparative literature, and his research and teaching are at the intersection of food studies, migration studies, and Mediterranean studies, with attention to Italian, Arabic, and Latino sources. So welcome everybody in this wonderfully interdisciplinary and cross-time histories panel.
Okay, good afternoon everybody. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you Emma for that introduction. So we did this slightly differently from the other panels today. This is going to be a roundtable, and so we've invited our participants. You see 6 of them up here. We've invited them to really speak for only about 5 minutes to give kind of position statements. And so that means that after a half an hour, we'll turn it over to our discussant, Dr. Kashdan, to kind of thread things together, and then we're going to open it up to you. So we're really hoping for an interactive discussion for about half of the session. So what I thought I would do is just read the prompt that we gave to the participants so that you would have a sense of where they're starting from, and then I will hand it over to our first speaker. So our theme is migration in the global Mediterranean. Political frameworks intrude on a utopian vision of the Mediterranean Sea as the equal and indivisible property of all who live along its shores. Migration has become an increasingly urgent reminder of the Mediterranean's disunity. Its current militarily controlled fragmentation presents a major reason that many historians have concluded that the Mediterranean as a zone no longer exists. Yet the Mediterranean Sea has always been a space of transit, and the sharp break with the past implied by today's language of crisis flattens our ability to understand both the persistent patterns of human relationships with the sea and the stakes of the particularities of the current reality. Migration in the Mediterranean, that is not only a contemporary political phenomenon, but a polychronic feature of the Mediterranean zone, expressed across politics, economics, art, history, and more. So how might we understand migration within the global Mediterranean? What comparisons, both within the Mediterranean's history and beyond the Mediterranean's geography, are possible in this broader frame, and what might we learn from them? If the concept of the Mediterranean carries particular connotations for some academic disciplines, what might be the implications of these epistemologies for current policies and politics around mobility and immobility in the Mediterranean? And if our move is to question the boundaries of the discipline of Mediterranean studies, do we also have a responsibility to speak to the kinds of boundaries and border regimes that include some people and not others? The tension between the normative limits of the classical Mediterranean and the received geographies of today's divided spheres of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East suggests oblique axes of comparison beyond the frameworks of empire, colonialism, and globalization. So now I'd like to tell you very quickly about our speakers, and then I'll hand it over. So, Marcus, forgive me, I didn't ask you ahead of time. Is it Zeman? Okay, thank you. Marcus Zeman is a PhD candidate in classics. His research is focused on the role that the Neo-Assyrian Empire played in bringing about a regional globalization of the Mediterranean. His paper addresses the rise of a global imaginaire in the empire's late period. Dr. Hannah Kostrin is a dance historian engaged in dance, Jewish, and gender studies. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Dance and affiliated faculty with the Melton Center for Jewish Studies and the Center for Slavic and East European Studies. Her paper today introduces broad considerations of a global Mediterranean for the aesthetic implications of migration, mobility, and immigration through dance performance. Dr. Richard Fletcher is an associate professor in the Department of Arts Administration, Education, and Policy. Trained as a classicist, his work explores the dynamic between ancient traditions and contemporary art. His paper today examines the confluence of the collective and the historical for refugees, crossings, and their containment in camps, in a series of moving image works at Documenta 14. Dr. Luca Paretti is a visiting assistant professor in contemporary Italian studies. He works on film history, nonfiction cinema, Jewish Italian culture, and Italian international history. In this paper, he looks at the Mediterranean Sea as the site of conflict, discussing 3 different types of subjects in movement: migrants, tourists, and maritime workers, on 3 different kinds of vessels: floating wrecks, cruises, and cargo ships. And last but not least, Eleanor Painter is a PhD candidate in comparative studies and is a co-founder and board member of the Migration Studies Working Group. In this paper, she links death and potential death at crossing to the limbo experienced by asylum seekers north and south of the Mediterranean Sea. So let us please welcome the participants today. And Marcus got some handouts.
That are taking place in the modern world right now, in which people are being connected more easily and faster than ever before. International airplane flights, the internet, the instantaneous movement of money across the nation's borders. But it is clear that ever since the dissemination of human communities across the globe, those communities have gradually become interconnected again over the course of millennia. Scholars have therefore treated certain regions that became highly integrated, frequently under a large empire's umbrella, as small-scale examples of globalization, or using Emmanuel Wallerstein's term, as world systems. One of those regions is the Mediterranean. Although Fernand Braudel's research on the Mediterranean helped to conceive globalization studies, scholars have been shockingly slow to adopt methodologies borrowed from globalization studies to study the ancient Mediterranean. This is starting to change. Some research has been done to talk about the Mediterranean under the Roman Empire and in the Bronze Age as undergoing globalization. However, this research has suffered from the same critique that has
Since the 90s, it made world systems analysis passé and given rise to globalization studies instead. Despite Wallerstein's protests, world systems analysis is almost entirely devoted to the study of economic flows. In contrast, globalization studies have emphasized that not only are there so-called objective criteria of globalization, such things as trade networks, the movement of people, financial flows, but the subjective aspects are also important. Subjective globalization is the reaction to the increased interconnection between communities and the awareness that human activities have both local and global implications. In other words, according to Roland Robertson, people recognize that time and space have essentially shrunk. This aspect is often called the global imaginaire or global imaginary, and I suggest that it is already present when our earliest literary texts from the Mediterranean appear in the early first millennium BCE. In the 8th century BCE, much of the eastern Mediterranean was united under the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian kings believed that it was their duty to bring the whole world under the Assyrian Empire. But they also instituted unprecedented centralized control over their empire. They developed the world's first postal system and built roads to encourage swift travel. They also forcibly displaced populations from the periphery of the empire to the center and vice versa, most famously the northern kingdom of Israel. Prior to the growth and centralization of the empire after 745 BCE, Greeks and Phoenicians had already established trade networks and colonies across the Mediterranean. The growth of the empire increased demand for resources, especially metals. In response to this demand, Greek and Phoenician networks intensified and new ones were forged. Suddenly, everyone was moving around the Mediterranean, whether to fight in wars or because of deportations or to join a lucrative trade adventure. This situation is comparable to World War II, which globalization experts have cited as the primary cause of the rise of the global imaginaire in the modern world. Very suddenly, people could be shipped off to nearly anywhere in the globe, and even people back home had to follow their loved ones' movements. Consequently, people became more aware of the interconnection between the local and the global. I suggest the same thing happened in the ancient Mediterranean, and taking a look at a few texts will be helpful. As part of the coronation ritual of the Assyrian king, he had to promise to internally expand the Assyrian Empire. In short, the Assyrian king's mission was to conquer the world and bring it to heel under one ruler. This implies that the world either was, or theoretically could be, entirely interconnected. Further confirmation for this comes from the reliefs in the throne room of Sargon II, which depict emissaries from the whole known world traveling to deliver tribute to Sargon. Again, the global is so condensed that it can be represented under one person. The contemporary Hebrew prophet Isaiah composed oracles against the Assyrian Empire. He rejected the authority of the Assyrian Empire and instead replaced it with the dominion of the supreme God Yahweh. Taking a look at the oracle found in Isaiah 11, note again the global local dimension. In rejecting the Assyrian emperor, Isaiah does not just assert the authority of Yahweh over Judah. He says that all the nations of the world will come to worship Yahweh. So here it is clear that the formerly local and particular God Yahweh will supposedly be meaningful for the entire global community. Lastly, let's consider the Homeric epics of the Iliad and the Odyssey. The politically disunified Greeks came together in the Iliad to cross the ocean and unite against the Trojans. Similarly, in the Odyssey, Odysseus travels around the sea, encountering many different peoples before regaining his identity and returning home. It would seem that the Greeks identified traveling away from home and encountering others as a means to negotiate what it meant to be Greek. In other words, Greek identity was determined by the global flow of peoples around the Mediterranean, the local conditioned by the global. I hope that I've shown that the beginning of classical and biblical history is also the beginning of a new global consciousness. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me all right? My height is such that I can never Danielle for inviting me to be on this roundtable and to Harry for moderating. It's really exciting to be part of this conversation, to think about this material in this way. What does it mean to feel part of the Mediterranean's lineage or legacy? How does this feeling work differently for people who are from the region and for people who have never been? My contribution to the roundtable today is about how dance performance travels and how audience members who watch those performances become part of the broader, arguably global context for that circulation. I will draw from my current project about the Jewish Yemenite Israeli dance company Inbal Dance Theater and their tours to the United States in the 1950s to address how we might consider migration within the global Mediterranean through bodily practices and how they travel. I'm interested in how we make diaspora through our bodies. After Inbal's first performance in New York in 1958, Jewish audience members danced the hora in the street. Margalit Oved, Inbal's principal dancer, who later made a life in Los Angeles, remembered this. Dance ethnographer Elka Koshel has explained how Israeli folk dancing gives Jewish participants a sense of Kalal Yisrael, of being connected to an international Jewish community through a bodily practice. By dancing an internationally practiced Ashkenazi, so European, originated rhythmic circle dance, the hora, in response to Inbal's performance, these audience members kinesthetically staked their participation in their transnational Jewish community. They expressed feelings of Jewish peoplehood through this kinesthetic act that also played out imaginations of the Mediterranean in the streets of New York. I start with this example as a way to explain phenomena that occurred in the US related to Inbal and a sense of a global Mediterranean. Inbal's tours enlarged the Mediterranean sphere through their circulating performance practices and audiences' interactions with them. By engaging with Inbal's performances, and also with classes that Inbal's company members gave in New York and Los Angeles, social receptions that local Hadassah chapters in Boston hosted for Inbal. Hadassah is a women's philanthropic organization, and seeing Inbal in one's own living room on television broadcasts, such as the popular Dinah Shore show, American Jews felt kinesthetic peoplehood with a Levantine idea of Israel through Inbal's tours. In my larger project, I define kinesthetic peoplehood as a feeling of kinship, of feeling part of a diaspora or cultural location through your bodily, somatic, aesthetic experience of it. I focus on kinesthetic peoplehood as a transnational phenomenon in which Jewish people feel connected to other Jews across geographic divides through their bodies, but this can apply broadly. Through kinesthetic peoplehood, Inbal's US reception became part of American Jews' actions osmosing Middle Easternness into their understanding of what Israel was and their relationship to it. This is in the 1950s. Historian Emily Alice Katz terms the phenomenon of American Jews incorporating Israeli cultural products and an Israeli imaginary into post-war American Jewish culture, bringing Zion home. Katz explains that predominantly Ashkenazi American Jews consumed Israeli cultural products like nonfiction literature and cookbooks, largely made by Americans for Americans, and imports like Judaica objects, folk dances, and art and music exhibitions in an effort to equate an American Jewish conception of Zionist Israeliness with an American Jewish conception of post-war pluralistic Americanness. Inbal's vibrant performances mixing Judeo-Arabic traditions through Euro-American dance logics enabled Americans to bring Zion home through dance. Inbal's performance practices included vocal ulations, hand mudras, and upward sagittal torso undulations that aesthetically identified them within Arabian, South Asian, and East African cultural currents. They also trained in German expressive dance and American modern dance, which framed their performances for the theatrical proscenium stage. American audiences recognized them as other and yet familiar. Inbal performers were Jewish, but they were a different kind of Jewish than the Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jewishnesses that were prominent in the post-war American imaginary of Jewish communities. There was a small Yemenite Jewish community in cities like New York and LA, but they were not really part of a popular American imagination. Reviews of Inbal's 1958 tours contained Orientalist propaganda from the America-Israel Cultural Foundation that told audiences Inbal's members were isolated from the modern world on the Arabian Peninsula for 2,000 years, so their performances provided a glimpse into the biblical past. This mapped onto Israeli government propaganda about Yemenite Jews in Israel. According to historian Esther Meir-Gutzenstein, the Israeli government appropriated Yemenite Jews' Arabic ethnicity to define indigeneity for a Jewish nation-state inventively rooted in the Middle East. Israeli propaganda suggested that Yemenite Jews had authentic connections to biblical antiquity because of their Levantine origins. However, Israeli nationalist rhetoric considered Yemenite Jews culturally subordinate to Ashkenazim. Marginalized first as a religious minority in Yemen, then as an ethnic minority in Israel, and then as religious and ethnic minorities in the US, Invol's members offer a subject position that suggests mobility, where I'm thinking about that here as transnationalism, and immobility, and I'm thinking about that as being stuck in an imagined past. This rhetoric drove how American audiences, particularly Jewish audiences, in the aftermath of the Holocaust and the first decade of Israeli statehood, felt their own closeness to Israel through kinesthetic peoplehood with Invol's performances. So, practitioners and spectators acculturate the idea of the Mediterranean and their connection to it into their bodies and emotions through kinesthetic peoplehood, or this is one way that they can interact. Our attention to kinesthetic dimensions of how imaginations of the Mediterranean travel inform the political stakes of how we address immigration across its physical, emotional, and geopolitical borders. Thank you.
So thank you to Danielle and Harry for the invitation. Danielle knows kind of what you get into if you're invited to do these kinds of things. So I am going to just put my clock on for 5 minutes, so I'll just talk for that time. I'm not going to read it. I think that the work I'm doing is tying together what our last panel was on in terms of immigration under Trump in this country and also the global Mediterranean. I have just written a book that's called No Philosopher King, An Everyday Guide to Art and Life Under Trump, and it is inspired by my conversion from being a classicist to being an art educator. And that conversion was instigated by an experience at an exhibition called Documenta 14 that happened in between Athens, Greece and Kassel, Germany in 2017. And this experience at this exhibition, which has actually been called a stateless exhibition, exhibition, was engaged very much with questions of debt, questions of nationalism, questions of the refugee crisis as well. My paper is really about a sensationalist moment in this exhibition that really hit the media, but also how artists within this exhibition can offer us more nuanced approaches to issues like global refugee crises and things like this. I would also want to mention a sense of shame at this moment in not only my current country's history, this country, but also my former country, the UK, in terms of the sense of white nationalism and white supremacy. And my paper is really about that. It's about that shame, and it is written out of that shame. And specifically, in terms of how questions of white supremacy are continuing from the 1930s, basically. And this idea comes from the Italian, well, it doesn't come from, but in terms of the issue that I'm talking about in my paper is the question of can there be an analogy between the refugee crisis in the Mediterranean and the Holocaust. And that was something that was raised by an event at Documenta 14, which was advertised with this image, this artwork by the Brazilian-Italian artist Symposium, that's called Exile, to promote an event by the Italian Marxist philosopher Franco Bifo Berardi called Auschwitz on the Beach. This event was used this to promote it, this image, and you can kind of imagine the bloody sea and the disintegrating body. And in the announcement of this event, Berardi described the salt water of the Mediterranean as like Cyclone B. And there was outrage about this analogy between the Mediterranean refugee crisis and the concentration camps. And there was protests by the Jewish community in Kassel. And what happened was basically that the Documenta team decided to cancel the event, the reading of this poem by Berardi called Auschwitz on the Beach, and replace it with an event called Shame on Us. And Shame on Us was an event that Berardi basically rips up his poem and saying, if my poem is going to cause suffering to anybody, I do not want to read it. But at the same time, he explained what he meant by shame. And the shame that he meant was aligning the fact that the white supremacy of fascism, as he calls it, hadn't been changed. And I'll just read one element of his response in this Shame on Us issue. Berardi talks about the controversy of meeting with members of the Jewish community in Kassel to understand the problem if he says or uses that name, leaving Auschwitz. Turning to the specific accusation of relativization, he was accused of relativizing the Holocaust, Berardi reframes it as contextualization. Such contextualization means that there is an affinity across the violence of white supremacy, specifically in terms of 1930s Germany and today's America, wherein humiliated, exploited workers are emboldened as white warriors. Berardi explains that this is why he decided to contextualize Nazism and to use that despicable word. Turning back to his conversation with the Jewish community, he heard how they spoke of suffering and trauma, and Berardi noted how suffering is the decisive word. In his final flourish, Berardi turns to his poem, how it is not a bad poem, its contents are not bad, but if someone is suffering, he'll forget about his poem. He'll write better poems. And there he rips up his poem and throws it out. And that was 5 minutes into that. But I did want to just pivot to this other image. This is a work by a Swiss artist called Miriam Kahn, and she included this as part of the exhibition of Doctoral, including a narrative of her own family's history of escaping Germany during the Holocaust, a Jewish family that came to Switzerland. And she calls this series of work Mare Nostrum, so she calls it RC. And she aligns in her drawings and in her writing the displacement of people during the Mediterranean refugee crisis with the movement of her own family. And specifically, what Documenta 14 wanted us to do as an exhibition, and not I think that Berardi was too extreme in what he was doing, but with this nuanced approach by this artist, we got to a sense of we Mediterraneans, a kind of collective idea. And Miriam Kahn's drawings were included in the publication for Documenta, South as a State of Mind, alongside diary entries by the filmmaker Jonas Mikas, who was contained in a prisoner of war camp in Germany as a displaced person, and also Hannah Arendt and her essay, We Refugees. And so that pivoting to the inclusive we, that sense of shame, is something that these artists have taught me from Documenta 14. And there's also other images, but I've done my 5 minutes. Thank you.
really like this 5 minutes format. I really thank you for the invitation. At the same time, as you know, us Italians are known for moving our hands a lot and talking a lot. So I try to be non-nationalistic as much as possible and stay within 5 minutes. So I want to briefly start by saying a couple of things about two young Italian journalists that brought, and rather than just bringing, they reconfigured two concepts that, of course, we use a lot when we talk about migration in the Mediterranean. That is the concept of frontier and the one of fortress. So Gabriele Del Grande has this incredible website, archive, and blog, both in Italian and in English, although most of it is in Italian. The list and most important talks about, contextualize the over 27,000 victims in the Mediterranean Sea between 1988 and February 2016, where he stopped the main part of the project. As Ruben was saying before, the important part of this project is not only the listing of the victims, but talking about them, putting names, focusing on the fact that these are people. Like all fortress, of course, the more we can circulate freely inside, these are the same years when the European Union really became something, the less people can come from outside, the more the outside was fortified, it really became a fortress Europe. The second journalist I want to say a couple of things about is Alessandro Logrande. Unfortunately, he died a couple of years ago from a sudden illness. His book La Frontiera is probably the most important book written in Italian on contemporary migration. This is the opening of a bookstore in Milan that chose to only show his book. I'm just letting him speak, actually. I'll only read the bold part. Do you want to read it?
Sure. There's an underground fault that cuts the Mediterranean in two from east to west, from the Near East to Gibraltar. It's a line composed of infinite points, infinite nodes, infinite crossings. Each one a story, each node a handful of existences. Each crossing a crack that opens. It's the frontier. It's not a precise place, rather the multiplication of a series of places in constant mutation that coincide with the possibility of ending up on one side or remaining on the other.
So if the frontier is now made of these points, nodes, and crossings, patiently and meticulously looking at them is what we should do. Polo Grande and Del Grande understood the Mediterranean frontier as a wide, complex, and fragmented space that goes from Gibraltar to Turkey and beyond, shifting constantly according to the political climate. I think that it's only appropriate that we talk about frontier in this context rather than border, because the colonial experience was for the Italians the exploration of an ideal Wild West, our imaginary and displaced frontier in Libya and the Horn of Africa, the fulfillment of an Italian B-series manifesto destiny. So traversing the Mediterranean Sea is nothing new. Crossing it by boat was a necessary act to undertake in order to reach these lands. I put here a couple of references from novels and from films of this crossing. Now I want to propose that we need to reconfigure the act of crossing the Mediterranean Sea as one of trespassing rather than traversing, and give to this term trespassing a positive connotation. Once again then, we need to ask where is the frontier of Europe, what is accessible and what not in the Mediterranean Sea, who can circulate freely and who cannot. I want to conclude by looking at three different kinds of trespassing vessels, the floating wreck, the cruise, and the cargo ships. That is the migrating experience, the tourist experience, and the circulation of consumer goods. They're related to three different figures, of course, the migrant, the tourist, and the maritime worker. I claim, however, that while the vessels that carry them follows different logic and purposes, none of these three figures is really free. What I'm conscious about, and I often stress with the student actually, the idea that migration can be a voluntary act. Most of the migrants in the Mediterranean are clearly not free. Their choice to depart is not free, and their arrival is not either. Famous is the recent case in the picture from August 2018 of the Diciotti ship that was held outside the Italian port of Catania waiting the authorization to disembark. The current Deputy Prime Minister of Italy, Matteo Salvini, has been formally accused of, and this is the language, illegal confinement, illegal arrest and abuse of power for this episode, but will not go on trial due to the Italian law that prevent public officials from being prosecuted unless authorized by the parliament. Now, the tourists on the cruise, I think, are also not free. They follow pre-structured routes, they are guided like sheep from point A to point B. They succumb to the rule of market and mass consumption tourists that, far from freeing them, have only enslaved them in cheap entertainment and quick visit to coastal cities. And these are three very similar cruises. Finally, the cargo ships are free to move. As we know, borders are open for capital and consumer goods, but not for people. But the people that work on the cargo ships are not. They are precarious human beings subject to the law that control their visas and their employments. There are several cases of sailors and cargo workers who remain stuck just outside ports for visa issues, or because the company that owns the ship goes bankrupt. This is the case, a recent case of sailors from Morocco who were stuck outside the port of Genoa for months. What we ought to do then, as scholars, as teachers, is rebuild the narrative of freedom in the Mediterranean Sea. One that free not only the migrating subjects, but also other subjects that circulate unfreely in the Mare Nostrum. Trespassing borders, questioning frontiers, visible and invisible, becomes then, I believe, a necessary act. And this was 6 minutes and 12, I'm sorry.
While I speak, and I'm not explaining them, but if you have questions about what I showed, I'd be happy to address them in the Q&A. To write about Mediterranean crossing is to write into the spaces of incomplete records, a kind of impossible archive, of risk, of near death, of loss. The ongoing counts of lives lost in this sea are rough underestimates. There is no standardized process for whether or when to recover bodies or vessels, or for determining whose responsibility that should be. In 2016, at least 362,753 migrants crossed the sea to Greece, Italy, or Spain. At least an additional 5,096 people died while crossing. We do not know most of their names. All who crossed confronted the risk of death and anonymous death. The death rate has since increased. You may have seen this list of the dead republished in The Guardian or on walls in LA. It's by an Istanbul-based artist and a couple of people who work with the Dutch NGO United for Intercultural Action. You can download it off of their website. They compile information from multiple sources to document loss of life for migrants nearing EU borders or having recently entered the EU. The black outlines of cells contain names or lack thereof, country of origin, cause of death, and information source. The deaths are marked by years, from 1993 to the present. Some are single entries, some, including many of the unknowns, indicate multiple lives. 2, 10, 283. The list displays its own incompleteness and speaks to the long-standing existence of these routes and risks. These deaths, which they say attributed to the fatal policies of Fortress Europe, occur on ramshackle vessels leaving Libya, in coastal city hospitals, and on the streets of European cities. By juxtaposing these incidents, the list asks us to understand the deaths as a European problem. The Mediterranean Sea is the world's deadliest border zone, and this is a fact with deeply local implications for individual migrants and the communities from and to which they depart and arrive. And in the next few minutes, I'm going to introduce 3 interrelated frames for engaging the regional and global concerns these deaths raise, in particular thinking of the Mediterranean as a site where national sovereignty and asylum regimes are entangled. The first frame is necropolitical, that is, death and crossing prompts us to understand the Mediterranean as a space in which, as Mbembe explains, states govern through death. Death and potential death are both the highest stakes and arguably most invisible experiences of today's precarious migrations. Media coverage of individual wrecks and mass drownings often refers to them as tragedies at sea. While such loss of life can certainly be understood in tragic terms, these drownings are not simply cases of people meeting their fate at the hands of nature. They are a consequence of their abuse and abandonment by states, or what Vicky Squire calls biophysical violence, consequences of border enforcement policies and practices that effectively abandon migrants to the forces of nature. Responses to Mediterranean mobility must account for biophysical violence as a function of empire and of the practices of border making and exclusion that accompany empire. And here the second frame. Comparisons of the Mediterranean to what Paul Gilroy called the Black Atlantic have rightly termed these dynamics of death, near death, and the colonial present the Black Mediterranean, which was historically critical to the construction of Europe as a space of whiteness. The term recalls Mediterranean slave trade, African diasporas, and the histories and erasures of Black experience and belonging between and across Africa and Europe. In Camilla Hawthorne's words, the Black Mediterranean is, quote, no longer just a precondition for modern racial capitalism, it is being reproduced every day at the nexus of anti-Black violence and Black liberation struggles across the Mediterranean basin. Importantly, the Black Mediterranean also produces and articulates transnational spaces within Europe, shaped by long-standing exchanges and cultural production. To this end, the Black Mediterranean is critical to decentering Europe as a set of homogenous communities and as the presumed source of understandings of identity and belonging. Literature, film, and art produced by Mediterranean migrants shift mobility discourses away from notions of Europe as superior because it is a migrant destination. The Black Mediterranean is also a site of limbo and precarity. In the oral histories I collected with migrants from countries in sub-Saharan Africa waiting in limbo in Italy's reception system, many said that Europe was never a destination. Boarding a boat in Libya was, most immediately, a way to flee imprisonment, torture, and enslavement. Migrants repeatedly told me that what they experienced in Libya transformed their sense of self and expectations for the future. Sea crossing, as well, is potentially traumatic. As one woman put it, quote, the scared was too much. Upon arrival in Italy, she was unable to recall the birthdays of her children, which created problems for her down the road. But formally, asylum adjudication accounts for the reasons a person fled, not what happened to them along their journeys. The third frame, then, understands the Mediterranean as a critical site for global questions about the limits of humanitarianism, human rights, and asylum. Since Italy closed its ports to the NGO-managed ship the Aquarius in June 2018, other countries have followed suit, holding asylum seekers at sea or supporting their return to the horrific conditions of Libyan detention centers. The labeling of precarious migration as a crisis or emergency enables these violent holding patterns as European national governments keep outsiders near or already living in Europe physically, legally, and socially outside of it. The Black Mediterranean joins the US-Mexico border as spaces where border security prompts the questions: who has the right to claim asylum? How are governments held accountable to international rights policies? And as we take up questions of the global Mediterranean here, I'd ask us to hold in mind how the sea and this region as physical, political, and discursive site is more than a border, an empty space, or a cemetery, but a space of production, creation, tension, and violence, dynamics with implications that resonate in border zones the world over. Thanks.
Thank you to all of our panelists for their time and for these compelling papers, which I think are so lucid and cogent that there's very little for me to do by way of teasing out common threads. These were very easy to follow and understand and complementary, so thank you for that. Obviously, building a discussion around the idea of a global anything invites a certain breadth of coverage, which presents us both challenges and opportunities as we try to bring these various papers together. My response then is purposefully built around what I hope are productively broad lines. So the major common theme, of course, has to do with movement, the movement of people through the Mediterranean space. But with the exception of Marcus's paper, and Marcus, please forgive me for setting yours against the others for just a moment. I hope you'll agree it's a useful comparison. With the exception of Marcus's paper, all the panels spoke about migration in the contemporary period, right? And I think this point of difference is actually a good place for us to begin. One of the challenges of the Mediterranean frame, and this has been well documented by researchers in the field, is squaring the classical Mediterranean with the contemporary, to say nothing of the many periods in between. The question for scholars of the area has long been whether there is any sort of meaningful continuity in the Mediterranean space. Thinkers like Brodel and Horton and Purcell said yes, but they based that answer on geographical and climatological features. When we here, on this round table, use the term Mediterranean, are we talking about a physical geography or a human one? Human movement, migration, provides us with a point of departure to answer this question. What Marcus called the global imaginary of the Mediterranean may itself represent a kind of constant. Not that the Mediterranean is a historically unified space, but that it has a consistent discursive unity as an imagined geography. What might this unity consist of? Well, the papers we've listened to today suggest to me two possibilities: dominance and what I have been calling traverse, although Luca suggests we might instead use the term trespass. Is the Mediterranean Sea a space to be controlled or a space to be crossed? In this light, we might understand what has been problematically called the contemporary migration crisis or emergency as the outcome of a major collision between these two schema, between dominance and trespass, or dominance and traverse. Eleanor closed our panel with an evocation of necropolitics, what happens when the desire to cross butts up against attempts to control. Migration and dominance cannot, in this light, coexist. The consequence is simply death. Luca evoked similarly dire consequences for the clash between frontier and fortress, but reminded us that while some types of movement in the Mediterranean have been forbidden on pain of death, other types, the types enabled and encouraged by capitalism, continue to be encouraged. He asks us to question, though, whether even those people imbricated in capital flows towards the sunk cruise ships are truly free. Richard encouraged us to consider the stakes of contextualizing migration in today's Mediterranean. Underlying the debate he described between contextualization and relativization at the 1914 exhibition is a question about the very possibility of comparison. In his conclusion, Richard prompted us to consider his title, We Mediterraneans, as a probing of the ethics of a Mediterranean frame. My response would begin with the idea that the Mediterranean frame demands comparison, not to relativize, nor simply to contextualize, but just to understand, right? Comparison along what Ian Chambers calls oblique axes is what a global Mediterranean perspective enables and demands. Such comparisons allow us to understand precisely the kind of discursive realities that I'm describing here through surprising and illuminating juxtapositions. And I want to stress that when I say discursive realities, I don't mean realities that exist only in discourse. I mean the discourses that shape reality, right? That delimit the horizons of the possible and what Richard might suggest is necessarily our Mediterranean frame too. Hannah offered us a different vision of these concepts, showing how the global Mediterranean travels not just as a discourse, but in the body and in bodily practices. And to her evocation of dance, we might add another form of shared kinesthetic personhood, the sea crossing. Is maritime migration in the Mediterranean itself a unifying feature of Mediterranean culture? The act of crossing and the tragic mortal consequences of such journeys are themselves shared and repeated physical acts that may establish a kinesthetic personhood of the migrant. Marcus showed us that the global imaginary of the Mediterranean is an ancient feature of Mediterranean discourse, if not a constitutive feature of Mediterranean discourse. Migration unavoidably destabilizes the unifying dream of control. The impulse to cross is a potent reminder of the divisions within an area that dominating powers would prefer to imagine as under unitary control. So, dominance or traverse, dominance or trespass, and is dominance really a fact of the Mediterranean, or is it a kind of unreachable goal, a retreating object striven after by various powers, whether they're imperial or colonial or capitalist? It seems to me that trespass, at least, must be understood to mean much more than just the movement of the physical body. Migration in the global Mediterranean entails also the spread, not just the spread of peoples, but the spread of arts and discourses and more. And I think I'll resist the urge to tie things up any more prettily than that, because some of the tensions between these papers would likely be sites of productive discussion. So I think our panelists will welcome your questions and comments, and I'll walk around with the microphone as necessary. But please join me in thanking them again one more time.
normalization to statelessness. You all can wonder why. But I was thinking, am I silly to dream of ever having a universal immigration law and like an international immigration law where countries can choose to join that law, and then that's it, everybody would know, like the law, the immigration laws here would be the same in Saudi Arabia. And I know the answer, like currently each individual country is struggling to agree to its own individual law, let alone an international one. But are we ever going to see it, or maybe not us, maybe our great-grandchildren? Or am I just dreaming? That's number one. Number two, I was looking at some statistics, and it seemed that stateless people in the world are anywhere between 12 to 15 million people. And I was looking to, just now I was looking at countries by population. That figure puts them the 75th most populated not country in the world. So maybe they should form their own country. Let's call that country X. Maybe the United Nations, if they are serious about immigration, should issue them a passport. And that nationality would be X. That's why I'm saying.
I'm just going to say one thing. If you need to dream, let's just dream bigger and imagine a world without borders. That would, be much easier.
I guess one response I would have is statelessness an identity that is claimed by the individual, or imposed. So that question of whether there's a work that I'm building up to write about called The Tempest Society by a Lebanese artist called Brincka, and it's about an experimental theatre group in Athens that is then adopted. The style of experimental theatre is adopted by one Syrian refugee in a school group at the same time. And he talks, his name is Malik, and he talks about, I can't remember the exact quotation, but is it, a refugee is a status that's imposed on me. It's not a status that I want. I have a state, but it's not being recognized. And I think that goes back to what Ruben was saying in the earlier panel about, and this is the dreaming thing, is will nation states have a version of citizenship that is actually inclusive? Included this country is a typical example. It's not, I don't want to be a citizen, I want who I am to be accepted within this country's citizenship. And I think that might be, I think that's a workable dream, that one. I think that one is the one where you can change what is classed as citizenship, where people do feel that they are part of something. And I worry about the soccer team of the stateless becoming an ability to point to the other without seeing the inclusiveness of the problem there.
Thank you, everybody. I have a kind of broad question. Eleanor mentioned the impossible archive, and you're thinking about those who perish, but I was wondering about how the question of the global Mediterranean opens up the question of the archive more broadly, and how you can think differently about archives and also about different types of collaborations with this kind of way of thinking about them.
Yeah. Sorry.
I can start. Thanks for the question. Did you also have a follow-up question, or were you just? Okay.
I just thought it was another microphone. I don't know.
archive, I think Ian Chambers also talks about archive as processes. And so one way of maybe rephrasing the question would be to ask what kinds of processes we can recognize or join or question in new ways, given what's happening with migration in the Mediterranean. Your question makes me think about what Harry has said about this sometimes disconnect between thinking about the Mediterranean in historical terms versus the contemporary, and whether the question of the archive might be a way to access some of those connections or maybe trouble them a little bit. I am thinking about the question of death, and I'm saying death and potential death to try and capture this sense of risk as always part of the journey. As an impossible archive, because in part I think it's a signal of all that is not captured by the bodies that are controlling what's happening in the Mediterranean. So to think that these losses, that there aren't real records and that there aren't real ways of recovering bodies, I would like to think that it's not in fact impossible, but that we in this time have to treat it as such because of how it's being controlled. I'm just thinking out loud. I'm going to keep churning on this, so I'll pass it along.
Thank you for your question. I think about archive in terms of the body a lot. And it actually, in this kinesthetic peoplehood that I'm trying to figure out, a lot of it relates to the knowledges that bodies hold, which is what I'm hearing in your question. I don't know if that's the question that you're asking, but that's how it's resonating with me. And I think a lot of it is about how we understand how different kinds of knowledges reside in the body. I think about Diana Taylor's archive in the repertoire a lot. Diana Taylor is a performance theorist, and she has this, she differentiates between knowledge that exists in established written repositories, which she calls the archive, and then knowledge that is passed on through different kinds of embodied kinesthetic and oral traditions that she calls the repertoire. And these two kinds of knowledges have had different colonial histories, and because of that exist in the way that we access them differently. And there's a dance scholar, Priya Srinivasan, who has taken that a step further into something that she calls the bodily archive. And Srinivasan's work, and some others that just for time I didn't unpack as part of the way that I was explaining the way that I'm thinking about kinesthetic peoplehood, are really very much part of the way that I'm thinking about this. I think we'll also address this question of like what's going on archivally when we're thinking about how people are circulating through all of the ways through this zone. And Srinivasan says that bodies are repositories of consistently quantifiable pieces of knowledge. She uses an example of, she's a Rwandan practitioner, and she uses an example of watching Ruth St. Denis, who's this kind of notorious figure in dance history in the 20th century, performing Hamsasa Mudra impeccably. Ruth St. Denis was a white practitioner in the early 20th century, and it was kind of like, how did she learn that if she, had not, studied this form? And then Srinivasan kind of went through a lot of archival processes to figure out what had happened there. But that moment of a practitioner recognizing something in another practitioner's body is the bodily archive of being able to quantify in your own body the knowledge that you have and being able to recognize it in someone else. And in that moment, kinesthetic knowledge becomes a discourse. And so that's one of the ways that is really resonating with me with your question is really figuring out how we can understand the way that different kinds of knowledges exist in like our fibers. And then through understanding knowledge in that way, I think that we can start to talk about what's going on in the corporealities that are implicated in these various crossings and otherwise through these spaces.
Your comment on the body makes me also think about the body as holding knowledge, or because also memory. And I'm thinking that in terms of these crossings, a more complete archive would include two kinds of memories. One would be the memories of people who have crossed and who are for many reasons unable to convey their stories or their experiences or don't want to. And so in that sense, it's an impossible archive because we don't have access to that for a range of reasons. And the other has to do with colonial memory, which you're also bringing up in some way, that until publics, European publics, Italian publics, are able to reckon with and recognize their own colonial histories in more tangible, active ways, then I think real understandings are impossible.
Okay, thank you. So my question is prompted by Dr. Castro's paper, but I think it's for everybody, including here, actually. I'm just curious about this. So you were talking about how this dance company kind of aesthetically signaled the Arab world or the Middle East, but at the same time, through staging their choreography as kind of Western concert dance, they were able to avoid maybe any negative connotations. But maybe that's not what you said about that. So that's what I was hearing, and I was wondering how the Mediterranean might work that way, the term Mediterranean might function that way, to intentionally avoid connotations with Islam in the Middle East, but to simultaneously function to disavow the Eastern Mediterranean. So I feel like this question kind of crosses over in terms of like what periods are we talking about. We can access this Greek classical history as the origins of Western civilization, and there's all these positive connotations, etc. Right? But when we talk about the Eastern Mediterranean today, it's very different connotations. Thanks.
Sure, thank you. I'll start, and then let me know if it's kind of going in the direction where you're curious. So one of the things that happened, Involve is a company that was founded in Israel by a dancer named Sarikaya, who herself was of Yemenite Jewish heritage, had been born in Israel, and she formed the company in 1949 in the wake of a very large immigration of Yemenite Jews from Yemen as part of this Israeli government airlift that was funded by the American Joint Distribution Committee. And so there was sort of a lot going on the ground at that time about Ashkenazim versus Mizrahim, white Jews versus Jews from the Arab world. And part of the goal of the company for her was to kind of celebrate Yemenite heritage in a way that she never knew, because even though she was of Yemenite parentage, she was orphaned at a very young age during World War I and was raised in an Ashkenazi orphanage. So for her, a lot of it was drawing on the performers in her company, who were mostly immigrants and refugees. But at the same time, in Israel, German expressive dance was the norm for theatrical dance. And then as we get to the 1950s, American modern dance kind of invades, and that becomes the norm if dancers wanted to be considered kind of higher, which she was really striving to be. When she toured, she was, Involve was presented by Saul Kurok, who was a Jewish American impresario who was just huge sensational touring, toured a lot of companies through the US from various locales in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. And one of the ways that Involve kind of was presented was in this very exoticized manner. And a lot of the work that they presented had different kinds of Judeo-Arabic themes to it, but one of their main pieces of repertory was a dance called Yemenite Wedding, in which portrayed what the title suggests. And the dancers wore theatricalized versions of costumes of traditional Yemenite wedding ceremonies. And so a lot of what was happening in the reception is that critics, it was not, I think the face I made was that the sort of like attempt at your American framing didn't always like protect the company from bad reviews. I mean, like the first year that they toured, it was like, this sensation, but no one actually knew what to do with it, the critics. They kept repeating this press release, like, you'll see a window into ancient biblical times because this company, they have been, before the airlift, no one had heard from them in 2,000 years, which we know is, just not evidential. But the framing was part of this attempt, and it aligned with a lot of other companies that Hurok toured at the time from countries outside the US that presented an idea of a national culture through a very particular kind of Euro-American staging. And so one of the things that I think is really interesting is the way particularly that Jewish American audiences received the work. And I'm looking at a lot of specifically Jewish periodicals and kind of doing embarrassingly stalking research on the people who are writing to figure out who they are. But there is something in there about, it's not a self-exotification, it really is sort of a partial self and other, like partially self, partially other. Like these people are like me, but they're kind of not like me, and they're my weird exotic brethren from this land that I feel this odd connection to, because now there's this thing related to Israeli statehood that, you know, there's all of this propaganda really aimed at the American Jewish community to connect them emotionally and financially to the state of Israel. So now I'm just going to go back to my notes that I wrote because I've gone kind of far around. Mediterranean to Caribbean. Yeah, so I think the other thing that's really interesting about this idea of the Mediterranean to sort of like face connections to Islam is that one of the things that was a challenge for Iqbal in the States is that critics could only really associate them with the Islamic world on Islamic terms, that there was not enough recognition that actually they were Jews in the Islamic world. That there was and the reading through this criticism, these reviews, is a real exercise in mid-century attitudes towards the other. So I try not to reproduce a lot of it because I think reproducing that language does a lot of damage. But there's this one critic who was writing about the work, and one of the things that Iqbal did, they were singing and dancing on stage at the same time and playing instruments, so they weren't just dancing. But this one critic kind of made some comment about how the music kind of recalls they call it the cry of the minarets, and so in that moment, that critic is very much aligning Iqbal with the Islamic world, but is aligning Iqbal with Islam in the Islamic world, not with Judaism in the Islamic world as such. So I actually am not sure, and I'll think about this more because I think it's a really important question, but I'm not sure that with Iqbal in particular, the Mediterranean was a way of avoiding connotations with the Islamic world. I think the connotations of the Islamic world were used as part of the sort of exoticization to tour them, and that actually the problem is that they were not really, the idea of Judeo-Arabic culture, there was not enough literacy for that to really understand what was going on in the work beyond like this trying to connect American Jews with ideas of Israel while marginalizing the eminent Jewish community that was in the United States in sort of small enclaves in some of the bigger cities.
Thinking about like who gets to use the Mediterranean, thinking especially about the classical past, there's among the alt-right community, there's a big sort of idea that they can use sort of the heritage of the Greco-Roman classics as a way to project this sort of unmixed and pure ancestry of Western civilization. And so a big part of what I'm trying to do is that going back to like the foundations of what's Greco-Roman civilization, like the Homeric poems, and then on the other hand, the earliest parts of the Bible, is that there's already this sort of deeply interconnected world, and people that know that they're deeply interconnected with people in other cultures. And so this sort of synthesis of different sort of linguistic and artistic forms are already sort of the underpinnings of what is the Greco-Roman classics, and that there isn't this sort of pure and unmixed origins which we can try to like strive to get back to, as the alt-right would sort of the things that we can do. There's already, it's already something that is very interconnected, and people are already concerned at the beginnings of so-called Western civilization with the movement of people and the fact that Greeks are sort of in this world where people are moving around the Mediterranean and interacting with other groups and borrowing things from them.
I'll add, sorry, I'm going to add just a couple words. What I've come to like about the term global Mediterranean is that when I say it, people go, what does that mean? And that's useful for me in that it forces people to ask, what does Mediterranean mean, right? Which is linguistically and culturally and historically and politically a European term. Other languages have other terms which we could use, but in scholarly terms we call it Mediterranean studies. Putting the global in front of it, I think, hopefully prompts us to ask what Mediterranean, who's Mediterranean, how does it travel, where, why, and under what power. With that in mind, I'll just two very small examples. One, if we're talking about contemporary Israel, the marshalling of the term Mediterranean in contemporary Israel has to do with an affiliation with Europe, right? And that's visible in things like Israel's participation in Eurovision, and in where and how Jerusalem and Tel Aviv tourism packages are marketed. So that's one example, right? But the other example, and Danielle knows this example because we were talking about it a couple days ago, is that when I did a project that involved interviews with Mediterranean restaurant owners in Ann Arbor, all of whom, because of local demographics, were Lebanese or Palestinian. And the food was Lebanese or Palestinian food, right? And so I asked, well, why this term? And their response was immediate and not hesitant, and not at all about disaffiliating from the Arab, but about a capitalist affiliation with the Mediterranean because they thought it would help them market their food as health food and attract that clientele. Right? So sometimes, sometimes things are really complicated and about identity, and sometimes things are about broad customer bases, which is also worth paying attention to, right?
Well, so my question is kind of a follow-up on that.
It's just you here on the video.
So my question is a little bit of a follow-up on that discussion about the term, because I can see your contributions in thinking about the interconnections as well as the comparative projects. But, and I've certainly heard the term and the discussion of Eastern European versus Western European, particularly in relation to migration and Europe's migration issues. But I wonder why we don't say, or why you don't say, or talk about the Italian-African border or the European-African border. So what things get obscured when we lean to the global Mediterranean instead of speaking about that border? And can we do the same thing in relation to the U.S.-Mexico border, which then always remains, in comparison, hyper-local, right? But we can't talk about that border as a global border. Is the sea really that different than the U.S.-Mexico border? Are we really talking about the African-Italian border or the European and African border? I think that it's worth thinking about what we might bring to light by shifting that language occasionally.
Just specifically, so the Eastern European element in this, in the, I guess, European refugee crisis, whatever you want to call it, the Berardi in his forthcoming book, The Second Coming, when he's talking about this controversy that happened at Documenta and the Ushers on the Beach of Holland, he talks about how, because he's trying to align the refugee crisis with fascism, basically, and with white supremacy, and that's why the contextualization is important, and it's not a relativization, it's actually a real call to action. in Eastern Europe, the rejection of the migrants comes from, there's a strong emphasis on Hungarian white nationalism that pushes back those migrants. And so that border and that element of that border is very much aligned with what's happening on the southern border of this country. It's not, you don't even need to go to the Mediterranean as border and the Italian, I mean, I think right now the Italian African border is bound up with those issues given the state of Italian politics right now. But I think maybe I do feel like that there was a kind of pinpointing of this question of, if we see this question of refugee crisis and immigration crisis in relation to this, and Baradi would talk about kind of oncoming civil war, which is about race and about whiteness, then that would align those, those groups. What connects the Trump regime with Eastern Europe right now is white nationalism. What would connect the refugee crisis in Europe right now with the crisis of the, whatever we call it, at the border here, would be white nationalism too. So that could be a way of aligning those. One way.
Was there a question over here?
Kind of a comment on the end of the question. I want to support Theresa's important point about the Europe-African disconnect, which of course is across both the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. And I think this differs in some crucial dimensions from the notions of archive being discussed here. If you think, for example, of Saidiya Hartman's memoir, Lose Your Mother, which is in a sense located in the displacement of Ghana. It is in a sense the impossibility of recreating any form of archive, whether bodily or in a sense colonial, that necessitates the writing in a sense of an interventionary memoir history of loss and a recognition of an impossibility of certain kinds of recovery as a point of departure. So that was the comment. My question is more direct, and it's a little question for Eleanor. You ended, Eleanor, by saying it would be helpful to raise important questions in response to this, in a sense, necropolitical data. And I wondered if you had one question in mind.
Notes. And one of the questions that I intended to raise that I think connects what's happening in multiple regions is the question of rights at the border and how we think about who has those rights and who can regulate them, who should regulate them, how they might change. And I think that comes straight from some of the necropolitical issues. I mean, other questions, I'm thinking in both of these cases about, in the last panel, one of the speakers said, looked out at the crowd and said, "Welcome to the borderland." We are in the borderlands here. And I'm also thinking about the ways in which sometimes we talk about these as if, and in talking about them in this way, I don't mean to sort of reaffirm that geopolitical line is the only space where we can raise some of these critical questions about rights or identity or exchange. I'm thinking also about Theresa's question, and I'm just going to sort of backpedal over to what you raised as well, and maybe other people in Italian studies can also speak to this. But your question makes me think about a couple of things. One is that there is this, I think, a specific history in Italy of thinking about this Italy-Africa border, and the production of race in Italy comes in part from that, and of associating, for example, people in the South with Africa, with Africans. And it would be interesting, there are scholars who are exploring this in more detail, but it would be interesting to think about that as it would then be put in conversation with the question of what the Italy-Africa border is today. I mean, I think that's really important. And then the other thing that your question has me thinking about is the ways in which, I mean, I think one response is that people are talking about Mediterranean because we want to signal this as a regional question and not specific to a single nation. At the same time, your question makes me think about the fact that Libya is perhaps is on the Italy side of the Italy-Africa border in some ways right now, because it has been granted it's been funded by the EU to patrol the sea, to detain migrants. It's functioning essentially, the border in some ways has been moved into North Africa. And I think thinking about this tension between, do we think about it as the Mediterranean or as Europe-Africa border, I think also helps highlight some of these issues in border policing.
Last comment, okay, I'll be brief. So yeah, that got me thinking about too. I think that there is an issue of trying to reconfigure the Mediterranean as the Euro-African border because we live out in Asia, and that of course that creates an entirely different problem and exclusion in a sense. The border is right, I mean Aaron is right, it's been shifting legally, okay, more and more toward Africa. That also means something. But I do also think that we too often forget that there is a land border between West Europe and Africa, which is the very first picture that I had, which is Ceuta and Melilla. That piece there should be one of the first problems that we discuss about. Why are we still keeping neocolonial or, places there? So that real border exists also on a physical level, and I think that's something that we don't question enough. Another thing I was thinking about is the idea, well, on the examples that you were making about the use of the Mediterranean, we also don't always don't discuss enough how Mussolini discussed it as a complex and sometimes very nuanced one. Finally, the notion of the archive, I don't know, maybe I'm too much of a historian, but for me an archive is a repository of things, and by definition is limited. It cannot be possible to archive everything because all archives are selections. So the issue, I have a hard time imagining an impossible archive, or more maybe the impossibility of recording things, but that's again, it's always the case. So what's different now? I'm not entirely sure. That's maybe a question.
With apologies for going over time, please join me in kind of thanking our panelists for their and we're concluding our day's events with a reception. There are treats, imminent, treats that are both imminent and imminent. And a huge thank you to Eleanor for her incredible work today.
On behalf of the Migration Studies Working Group, I want to thank everybody for participating today, and everybody who is here, and everybody who has been here today. This is our third annual symposium, and it's been such a wonderful space for making connections between undergraduate students, people working in community organizations in Columbus, graduate students, faculty, postdocs, researchers, everybody in the community. And going forward, if you all are invited to join the group, of course, and we host meeting events, we host discussions of works in progress. You can always contact us if you want to host an event or be part of future symposiums. So thank you everybody today. I look forward to our group working together with all of you in the future. And thank you so much to Eleanor, Carolyn, Eric, Kelly, other members of the board, and everybody who participated today.
Don't